All righty, how y'all doing? All right,
Yay!
thanks for being here with us this morning. Thank you to everybody for having us. We are Dr. Story and Jaison. She's a professor, I'm an activist, and it's really appropriate that we are here to talk about diversity and inclusion because both in our personal and professional lives, we kind of work around those issues. I mean, you're a professor, I'm an activist, so in our professional lives, we find ourselves oftentimes championing more diversity, more inclusion in academia, in social justice, whether it be around LGBTQ issues, people of color, black folk in particular, women, poor folk, and then even in our personal lives as two black queer people navigating the South, navigating Louisville, we often find ourselves in spaces as one of the only one or two and having to fight back against social stigmas about people misreading our black bodies as being straight and always having to rewrite scripts and really championing diversity in different spaces. So on this topic, what came to mind first for you about creative folk and diversity and inclusion? You thought about somebody in particular.
Yeah, I thought about an artist in particular. When we were asked to do this talk, I thought how much impact art has had for marginalized folk and the most vulnerable in our communities. How art gives marginalized communities and other creative works an opportunity to see themselves and find themselves, usually ushering in inclusivity and diversity way before mainstream media, news, film, television, so on and so forth. So when I thought about what we should talk to you all about today, Prince comes to mind. When Prince,
any Prince fans?
Any Prince?
All right,
yes. Cool. So when Prince died in 2016, I was absolutely devastated. I was devastated in a way that surprised me and that shocked me. I love Prince as an artist and a creative person, as well as I love their music, but I was really surprised at how impacted I was emotionally, like I knew Prince. Like me and Prince was BFFs, like I was going to Prince's crib and we were chilling.
You had that when it comes to artists.
Yes.
You tell about Michael Jackson when Michael Jackson died.
I like had to pull over in a gas station and I started busting out crying and all that. But you know, I really found, I went on Twitter and put the hashtag in Prince in 2016, and this tweet came up, and I thought it was really profound and impactful, and it really showed why I was mourning in the way I was. And it said, thinking about how we mourn artists we've never met. We don't cry because we knew them. We cry because they helped us know ourselves.
Absolutely.
And I think that for marginalized and oppressed, underrepresented groups especially, art and creative works are dire and important for us to not only see our reflections, but for us to think about our place in the world.
Yeah, and so we both were thinking about seminal works that helped us to see ourselves reflected in the screen. I think about, for example, Scandal. And the Scandal was the first TV show in more than 40 years that had a black woman as lead. We think about Moonlight winning an Oscar, and that it really comes down to if you give folk opportunities, they if it comes down to the dollar, they're money-making opportunities, but also they're really important for people to see themselves reflected. So for me, one of those things was Noah's Ark. Anybody heard of Noah's Ark? Okay,
yes.
Which is actually on YouTube now. So Noah's Ark was actually the flagship show on the Logo Network, which now created RuPaul's Drag Race and all kind of other series. But it was created by Patrick M. Polk. It was a sitcom for 30 minutes that centers around four friends, black gay men navigating life. It's sort of like a Friends or Living Single for black gay men. It was a flagship show, and it was the first time I really saw myself reflected. We'd be at your apartment watching it like every week.
Yeah.
So that was a show for me that was really important, as was, for example, the film Moonlight, to see myself reflected in a mainstream movie in movie theaters. That was really important for me, and I can only imagine how that was for people who are much younger than I am.
Yeah, and for me, when I realized I was like gay with it, I was like, oh gosh, I'm gay and black with it. I naturally, as a curious and intellectually curious person, I naturally found a lot of my narrative and who I was in anthologies and books. So my first anthology that really made an impact was Does Your Mama Know?, which is a black lesbian anthology around coming out stories. Also, James Baldwin's work, Nikki Giovanni, and of course, both of us have been tremendously impacted by Paris is Burning in terms of the intersection of exploring the intersection of queerness, blackness, and creativity. It's beautifully done, especially most of the drag queens and femme queens in it, the way in which they articulate, synthesize, and think about the reality that they've come to know is profound and astute. So if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to check it out. But nonetheless, for both Jay and I, we really look to creative works to discover ourselves, reevaluate where we were, and to think about the impact we wanted to have on the world.
Yeah, so why is diversity and inclusion important? And what do we mean when we even say those things? I mean, I guess on a very basic level, it means, are you incorporating people who don't look like you, who aren't from the same economic background as you? And usually that's people of color, especially black folk, that's queer and trans folk, that's women, that's Southerners, people from Appalachia. It could be people who are disabled, any number of people who don't look like you, who aren't necessarily a part of the mainstream. Are they incorporated in your business, in your creative works? Are they important as your clientele? And of course, just thinking about America, it's not a very diverse place. I mean, Dr. King said, for example, that Sunday at the church house is the most segregated hour in America. We think about Louisville, then we have Portland, the West End, which are black and poor white. We have the East End, right? We don't have a transit system that allows for
those communities to connect, exactly.
Yeah, and I remember even when they were trying to support merger, when the city and the county merged many years ago, Mayor Abramson, the old mayor, said that Louisville had to merge because the city and county had to merge because Louisville was getting older, blacker, and poorer. And that was a direct quote. The mayor said that, as if to say that blackness, intergenerational, old, right, or poverty, those people somehow are not of value to a community, right? So diversity isn't always pretty. It's not always the whitest, the brightest, the cleanest, right? But so even to the mayor of our fair city, older, black, or poorer was a bad thing, right? And I think that we know that it takes all types, right? And so I think the creatives, even in our own city, have led, think about like Smoketown and Nulu, that it really has been boutique owners, small business owners that have kind of led a revitalization of places that were once forgotten about because they were poor or black.
Yeah, and I think that when you think about diversity and inclusion, we have to think about the spaces in which we grow up and come to know ourselves. And unfortunately, in the United States, the way that our neighborhoods are set up, and not just this city, but cities all over the United States, are very segregated. Most of us grow up in neighborhoods where people reflect our embodiment and our socioeconomic status, right, verbatim. So you live in an area where folks are the same class status. Most people are looking like you in terms of race and in terms of value systems, so on and so forth. And so we really don't get a confluence of culture and get introduced to folks who are different from us until we become very grown, right? And this is how you get into faux pas around inclusion and diversity. This is how people mess up when they're trying to be inclusive and diverse. And so it's not just the church hour, but it's literally our whole lives. The way in which the United States is structured are really, really segregated and prevent us from being inclusive and diverse in a lot of ways. And so we see this lack of inclusion and diversity all over different spaces. You have universities that are grappling with and battling with being more inclusive when it comes to diversity and when it comes to underrepresented faculty, such as black faculty, queer faculty, so on and so forth. Yale, in fact, 13 Yale professors just withdrew from the ethnic studies program because they were expected to perform this labor in addition to their regular professorial jobs, although they were not compensated for such. And so they had worked a number of years, had begged Yale to really put financial backing, right? Because it's one thing to say, we're an institution that looks for diversity and inclusion. It's another thing to put money behind those things, right? And the problem with many universities, nonprofits, is they do that in lip service ways, but they don't have any kind of financial investment in really being inclusive and really being diverse in those types of things. We also see it in the nonprofit sector. We see it in gay public spaces, right? Gayborhoods, when you think about going and traveling to other major cities, and even here, right, there aren't a lot of black queer spaces or Asian and queer spaces, for instance. There are a lot of white queer spaces where people of color who are queer come in, they're antagonized, there's various microaggressions, so on and so forth. So almost every space we, kind of inhabit has an issue with inclusion and diversity.
So where can you go wrong if you don't have a diverse person, for example, on your staff? Say you work in PR. Anybody recognize what this is? Y'all see what's coming? So Kylie Jenner, I think that's Kylie.
Yeah, that's Kylie.
Kylie Jenner. So Pepsi did an ad, or was it Coke?
No, it's Pepsi.
Okay, yes. Oh, that's Kendall. Who's that at? Yeah, that's Kendall.
Oh,
okay,
that's
the one in the
Kendall?
Kardashian
Okay.
child.
Ciao.
So they do this ad, selling soda, and the imagery of the ad is like it channels like Black Lives Matter and queer liberation and the women's rights movement, and so you feel like, oh, this is really some dope shit like Black Lives Matter in the Pepsi ad. But let's see how that goes south. We'll talk about the reactions. So we're gonna play for you all. Who brings racial harmony to America and how? Okay, we'll turn the audio. You really don't even need the audio. It's just just kind of an instrumental in the background. Just look at the imagery.
Okay. It's the urban beat.
So she's like chilling, minding her own business,
And modeling, I guess.
And modeling, yeah.
Yeah.
As people, she's not modeling
As there's social justice marches in the back.
through the streets and there's civil unrest, and so she's like, "Well, what's going on?"
The Asian violin player
Yes, of
drinks
course,
Pepsi. Yes.
All the people of color frustrated with the state of affairs.
Okay. Society is in a state of unrest.
Yes.
All these folks are coming to join the movement. And you want me to?
Yeah.
I'm gonna fast forward through it. Yeah.
So anyway, long story short, Kendall or Kylie, who is it? Okay,
Kendall.
so Kendall's like, well, how can I bring peace to this nation? How can we end racism,
How
sexism,
can
homophobia?
I, as the single
police
white woman at the
brutality.
protest,
So she
make
grabs
an
her
impact?
Pepsi and she gives it to the cop, and all is well.
All is well. No more police state, militarized police.
No,
the police
like,
are now
yeah.
friendly.
Look,
To the
look,
protesters.
victory. The
Yeah,
world,
they're
the
like,
world is.
thank you, Kendall. Yes, you saved everything.
So this is
You're
right. So
amazing.
you give it up for the Jenners, right? They saved the world. But no, so this commercial airs, of course, and they didn't anticipate not just on Black Twitter, but the world at large, the backlash. Like, how dare, number one, you all co-opt movements like Black Lives Matter and women's liberation and all those kinds of movements, and then how dare you have people of color as props and background extras, and then you have this white girl who is the quintessential, what isn't she, a self-made billionaire, but nonetheless, she somehow solves all the world's problems by giving a Pepsi to a cop, right? And so, like, yo, who was in the boardroom as you all thought about and okay this ad, right? Where was the black person like, yo, you can't do that. Like, that's gonna go totally south. And so that's just an example of what can go wrong when you don't have people within your organization. And so we see this time and time again with organizations and corporations that keep making cultural and social faux pas.
Thank you. Okay, yes. Okay, yes. And so I think it was in 2017, Jaison and I hosted a Black Arts Matter talk at the Carnegie in Indiana.
Yeah, the Carnegie Museum.
And Black Arts Matter was created out of the lack of representation of Black art. Oftentimes, Black art and creative works are seen as not universal, as having a slanted message, as only talking about a specific community, whereas white art is not understood in those same ways, and it's not pigeonholed in those same ways. And so throughout the conversation with the artists who were committed to showcasing Black art and presenting folks in their art who are marginalized and underrepresented, a lot of the frustration came up in terms of them being artists and the art world's apprehension or hesitancy in including their narratives and giving space to them.
So there are some ways in which Louisville is getting it right.
Yes.
We think about like the new director, Idris Goodwin over at
Stage One.
Stage One, yeah. Actors Theater with the Humana Festival and other productions. They're always committed to bringing Black productions and a variety of productions. We've been here at the Speed several times doing talks
And the Speed's been very intentional about using a spreadsheet in actuality to create more increased diversity for the various positions here. And you see it reflected in the staff. You certainly see it reflected in the programming. And so there are a lot of ways in which folks in Louisville are getting diversity and
shout
inclusion
out to
right.
the Speed Cinema as well. In particular,
Yes.
one of our first ventures here was with Dean Otto, the curator of film here, who made sure he brought films like Moonlight, Daughters of the Dust, Pariah, all kinds of Black films, and invited us to come and do discussions around those films.
And when you think about this idea of being diverse, a lot of folks think, oh, well, I'm a business owner or I'm a designer and I want everyone to feel included. And if I somehow focus on diversity and inclusion, then people are going to feel excluded. No one is going to...
Race films or race records, yeah.
Yeah, and the emphasis will be on the underrepresentation. But as we see with folks like Oprah, Ava DuVernay, Issa Rae, Shonda Rhimes, inclusivity and diversity, when it comes to your creative creative work is not only necessary but lucrative, right? These women have made a career about producing and putting money behind creative projects and works that are more inclusive, right? So even when you think about Issa Rae's show, when you what is it?
Insecure.
Insecure. When you think about Insecure, I always want to call it Awkward Black Girl, which was her YouTube series, but Insecure, the cast of that show aren't all Black, right? So even within Black creative works, they tend to be very, very inclusive to everyone, right? That you kind of come in contact with, unlike a show when we think about a show like Friends, right? Which is set in New York City, and every cab driver they get in is American and white, which is, have you ever been to New York? Also everybody, like the bagel shop owners, I mean, every neighborhood that they would frequent, you know, I've never been to New York City and I felt like, oh, this is an overwhelmingly white, cis, straight space. But certainly Friends showcased that part of New York and made it seem as if that is Manhattan and the boroughs are where the people of color and people of different socioeconomic backgrounds live, right? So we see that even though Friends was a show that had longevity, all of the critiques after Friends have been about the lack of diversity and inclusion, the fact that they wanted to create this fantasy and this faux New York, as opposed to the New York that we all love. And we all love New York because of the diversity, because of the confluence of cultures.
But somehow
right?
that show was seen as a universal show.
Yes, it was.
Do you remember when Best Man Holiday came out a few years ago, and the headlines were like, race movie tops the box office, like Black movie, and it's like, so like Home Alone is somehow a universal movie, but Best Man Holiday, because it's a Black cast, although the movie had nothing to do with Blackness in particular, it becomes a race movie, a race, you know, like everything becomes, you know, a TV show about Black people as opposed to a universal experience. And so clearly it can be a lucrative business to create projects that are diverse and inclusive.
No, certainly,
Yeah.
certainly.
So where do we go from here?
So where do we go? How can we create a more inclusive future for ourselves and for our creative projects? What are some of the ways in which we can expand our definition of inclusion, so on and so forth? I mean, so our first bit of advice is listen to our podcast.
Yeah, www.strangetruthpod.org.
No, yeah, we're like serious, but not really serious. But when me and Jay were thinking about some practical things that you all could think about, we thought about if you own a business, for instance, examine your clientele base. Is it mostly made up of folks that look like you, reflect your same experiences, so on and so forth? You know.
Yeah, what's the makeup of your company, your collective, your team? Is it mostly reflective of people from your same background or experiences?
Yeah, if you're a curator, right, of an art space, are you giving opportunities to folks that don't reflect your identity, right? Folks that are underrepresented, folks that could utilize that space for bringing in different clientele, you know, so on and so forth?
Yeah, number 4, if you're a philanthropist or a CEO, as we saw earlier, do you continue to donate and or give money to the same organizations and individuals every year?
Right, or are you trying to reach out and expand who you're marketing to, who you're, you know, what are the new nonprofits, what are the new organizations?
And also understand that not everybody is incorporated. There are collectors of people doing great work that are not following the traditional pathway of a 501c3 or a board of directors. They may be a collective of folk who are loosely organized, but they still need them coins.
No, exactly. And think of, you know, use your creativity in terms of that, right? Not only in building your business and your brand, but using it in terms of creatively thinking about the ways in which you can expand your brand, your business, your corporation, your collective, your institute, to be more inclusive to people of various backgrounds other than yourselves, right?
Number 5, if you're a developer, are you giving opportunities to contractors and workers of color, et cetera?
Right. Are you developing in neighborhoods where you're taking advantage of those folks that live there, right? Because it's cheaper and you can gentrify it? Or are you trying to create...
Make sure you incorporate,
exactly,
the folk who live
incorporate in
there.
businesses and try to revitalize that community. So think about your intentionality in terms of developing, right? What is your intention? Do you want this neighborhood to grow and flourish? Or are you just trying to exploit the fact that the city has abandoned this part of the neighborhood and therefore you can make a cute coin, right?
And then finally, if you're a fashion designer or perhaps you make cartoons or video games, what bodies do you design for? What folk are pictured in your magazines, in your video games? What models do you use? So just be much more critical.
Is there sizeism at work? Do you think that high fashion ends with a size 4? Do you think that couture, right, is wrapped up in certain types of bodies? And that's the only way you'll be able to pull off your fashion or the coutureness, right? So thinking about those types of things when it comes to envisioning your fashion lines and your products. So.
Well, thank you all very much.
I mean, thank y'all.